My name is Arya. I'm in my 30s now, but the version of me in this story was younger. Quiet in ways people mistook for small, careful in ways they misunderstood as compliant. I've spent most of my adult life working in environments where confidence is loud and credit travels upward fast. I learned early that when you don't announce yourself, people tend to narrate you instead. Most people described me as dependable, low maintenance, the one who would stay late without complaining, who would fix problems without needing applause. I wasn't invisible because I lacked ability. I was invisible because I didn't demand to be seen. And in certain systems, that's not neutrality. It's a role. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing someone for sport or reclaiming power through humiliation. It's about a moment that split my life in two, and the long, quiet path that followed. A path shaped by choice, restraint, and an understanding of how accountability really works when power is uneven. At the center of it is a single decision. I took the fall for a mistake my boss made. Not because I was forced, not because I didn't know better, but because at the time, it felt like the least destructive option. I believed loyalty would be remembered. I believed context mattered. I believed silence would protect everyone involved. I was wrong about some of that. Right about other parts in ways that took years to fully understand. This is a story about what happens after the meeting ends, after the apology is accepted, after the official record is closed. It's about what happens when he kept his title. I lost my career, and how that kind of loss doesn't arrive with fireworks or scandal, but with paperwork, quiet nods, and a slow erasure of future plans. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no courtroom scenes, no viral moments. There was just time and attention and a growing awareness that silence can either erase you or prepare you. That invisibility can be a weakness or it can become cover. I'm telling this now not because I want sympathy and not because I think I did everything right. I'm telling it because many of us live inside systems that reward noise and punish steadiness, that mistake calm for consent. And because the most important reversals don't always look like victories from the outside. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through who I was in that room, how the pattern formed long before the mistake, and what changed when I stopped confusing patience with powerlessness. This is an honest account. No embellishment, no villain monologues, just the anatomy of a quiet dominant story, one that unfolds slowly and ends without applause. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stayed silent because it felt safer than being right? In the office, I was the one people relied on without really looking at. Not because I hid, but because I never competed for attention. I arrived early, left after things were done, not when the clock said so. My calendar was full of other people's priorities, my name threaded through projects that carried someone else's signature at the end. To them, I was steady, useful, safe. I didn't challenge ideas in meetings unless I had proof that silence would cost more later. When I spoke, it was measured, unemotional. I didn't interrupt. I didn't perform urgency. That alone placed me into a category before anyone bothered to ask who I actually was. They called me detail-oriented. It sounded like a compliment, but it functioned like a fence. Details are necessary, but rarely celebrated. Vision gets the spotlight. Execution gets the workload. I was the person managers trusted with fragile things. Timelines that were already broken. Teams that were quietly burning out. Processes no one wanted to untangle. I fixed what I could, documented what I couldn't, and handed it back polished enough that leadership could move on without discomfort. No one asked how often I absorbed blame upstream to protect the system. No one noticed how often my role expanded without title or pay, because I never framed it as a complaint. I framed it as responsibility. My boss, let's call him Daniel, once introduced me to a visiting executive as the one who keeps everything running. He said it with a smile. I smiled back. The executive nodded, already scanning the room for someone louder. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. In performance reviews, my feedback was consistent, indispensable, reliable, calm under pressure. What was missing was just as consistent. No mention of leadership trajectory, no articulation of growth beyond more of the same. I was praised in ways that kept me exactly where I was, and I accepted it. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed contribution would eventually speak for itself. I believed that competence accumulated, that restraint built trust, that someone was paying attention, even if they didn't say it out loud. I didn't see myself as invisible back then. I saw myself as patient. In meetings, I sat slightly to the side, not physically, but conversationally. I watched who spoke first, who echoed whom, whose ideas were credited only after someone else repeated them. I noticed patterns, but I didn't yet interpret them as warnings. I told myself every organization had its rhythms. You learned them. You adapted. When things went wrong, I was pulled into quiet rooms to help stabilize. When things went right, I was looped out of the narrative early. Not excluded, just unnecessary once the risk passed. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt at first. It feels like trust, like being spared politics, like maturity. You tell yourself you're above the noise. What I didn't realize then was that being underestimated isn't neutral. It shapes expectations. It determines who gets grace and who gets scrutiny, who is allowed to fail publicly, and who is expected to absorb failure privately. I was expected to absorb. Daniel never said it outright, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. I handled complexity. He handled optics. When something required explanation upward, I prepped the narrative. When it required reassurance downward, I delivered it. He trusted me because I made his role easier, not because he understood the cost of that trust. To him, I wasn't a risk. I was a buffer. And buffers are designed to take impact so other parts don't have to. At the time, I wore that role like a badge of honor. I told myself I was essential. I told myself that being needed was enough, that staying calm while others postured was a kind of strength. I didn't yet understand that strength without visibility is easily reassigned, that loyalty without leverage is interpreted as availability, that when a system decides who it can afford to lose, it doesn't start with the loudest voices. It starts with the quiet ones who've already proven they'll hold the weight. That's who I was to them. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. We were in a mid-level planning meeting. Nothing dramatic, just timelines and dependencies. Daniel had presented a revised rollout plan, one I had helped restructure the night before after catching a conflict that would have stalled an entire department. I didn't expect credit. I rarely did. But I did expect accuracy. Halfway through the discussion, a director asked a sharp question about a metric that didn't align. Daniel paused. Just a beat too long. Then he said, "That must have been a miss on Arya's side. We'll tighten it." It wasn't said cruelly. It wasn't even said defensively. It was casual, almost reflexive. No one reacted. No raised eyebrows. No follow-up. The conversation moved on, already absorbing the explanation as truth. I remember feeling something subtle. Not anger, not shock. More like a quiet disorientation. I replayed the document in my head, the version history, the email chain where I'd flagged that exact metric and suggested an alternative Daniel had chosen not to use. I told myself it didn't matter. It was easier to let it go than to interrupt the flow of the meeting. Correcting him publicly would have felt disproportionate, petty even. I told myself leadership required perspective. Afterward, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Thanks for backing me up in there," he said, lowering his voice like we shared an understanding. I nodded. No problem. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to rationalize. But cuts like that don't disappear. They stay just under the surface, unnoticed until something brushes against them later. Over the next weeks, similar moments appeared. A slide labeled incorrectly. A process change announced without context. Each time, the explanation drifted in my direction. Not forcefully, just enough to redirect attention away from him. And each time I stayed quiet, part of me believed this was the cost of being close to decision-making. That proximity came with exposure. That leaders needed someone who could absorb friction. I'd seen others do it too. Usually women, usually the most competent in the room. No one said it explicitly, but the message was consistent. Correcting the narrative mattered less than maintaining momentum. The thing is, when you don't correct the first small cut, the system learns something about you. It learns you won't disrupt. That you'll carry discomfort without complaint. That your silence is reliable. I didn't confront Daniel. Not because I was afraid, but because I still trusted him. I assumed the balance would self-correct, that he'd remember who actually caught the issues when it counted. Instead, something else happened. The explanations became easier, the deflections quicker. In one meeting, when the regional lead questioned a delay, Daniel gestured lightly toward me and said, "We're recalibrating expectations internally." Internally, me. I noticed how eyes shifted, not with suspicion, but with acceptance. The room had decided where accountability lived. And it wasn't where authority did. I started documenting more carefully, not out of fear, out of habit. I'd always kept notes. Now I dated them. Saved versions, archived threads. It wasn't a strategy yet, just an instinct I didn't fully understand. There's a particular loneliness in realizing something is wrong, while everyone else treats it as normal. I'd replay conversations on my commute home, wondering if I was overreacting. If my sensitivity was the issue. If this was just how things worked at higher levels. I told myself it was temporary, that once the quarter ended, things would reset. That trust went both ways. What I didn't realize was that this was the beginning of normalization. That the first small cut wasn't about blame. It was about testing how much weight I'd carry without shifting. And I carried it. Quietly, competently, without protest. Which is exactly why it didn't stop. After the first few incidents, something subtle changed. Not in Daniel, but in the room. It wasn't overt. No one spoke to me differently. No one questioned my competence to my face. But the way responsibility flowed began to shift, like water finding the easiest channel. When something was ambiguous, it landed with me. When something was visible, it passed over me. At first, I told myself this was efficiency. I was good at untangling problems. People knew that. It made sense they'd come to me. But the pattern grew too consistent to ignore. Deadlines slipped, and I was asked to help stabilize. Miscommunications surfaced, and I was asked to clarify downstream. Decisions made without my input suddenly required my explanation. And always the language was neutral. No accusation, no blame, just assumptions. I noticed how Daniel spoke when I wasn't in the room. Not because I was eavesdropping, but because people would reference it later. Daniel mentioned you were still working through that. Daniel said you'd flagged some concerns. Sometimes I had. Sometimes I hadn't. The line blurred easily when no one asked for specifics. I began to realize something uncomfortable. My silence wasn't being interpreted as professionalism anymore. It was being interpreted as consent. In meetings, I'd catch myself rehearsing responses in my head, and then discarding them. Correcting the record felt risky. Not because I feared retaliation, but because I feared being seen as difficult, defensive, emotional. Those labels don't land equally, so I chose restraint. Again. I told myself this was strategic patience, that credibility came from consistency, not confrontation, that the long game mattered. But the long game assumes a level playing field. One afternoon, a colleague pulled me aside after a particularly tense meeting. "You know," she said carefully, "you don't have to take responsibility for everything." I smiled. I know. But I didn't change anything, because by then the role had solidified. I was the one who would step in, who would smooth things over, who would take ownership without needing authority. Reliable, useful, invisible. What made it harder was that Daniel wasn't cruel. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't even particularly calculating. He was just protected by his title. by his confidence, by the assumption that leadership errors were complex, while execution errors were personal. And I was part of the execution layer. The more I compensated, the more others relied on me to do so. It became normalized, not just for Daniel, but for the organization. My work expanded laterally, not upward. My accountability deepened, but my influence didn't. I started noticing how often I was looped in after decisions were made. How often my role was to implement, explain, and absorb reaction. There's a quiet erosion that happens when your contributions are expected, but your perspective is optional. You stop seeing your voice as necessary. You start measuring your value by how little disruption you cause. I told myself I was choosing peace, but peace that requires self-erasure isn't peace. It's postponement. Still, I stayed. Not because I was trapped, but because I believed in the work, in the team, in the idea that fairness eventually asserts itself. I didn't yet understand that systems don't correct imbalance on their own. They adapt to it. They optimize around whoever will carry the load without complaint. And I was very good at carrying load. By the time I noticed the normalization, it was already embedded. In language, in expectation, in the unspoken hierarchy of who could fail and who could not. The disrespect wasn't loud. That's what made it dangerous. It didn't provoke. It accumulated. And I kept telling myself I could handle it. That I was strong enough. That it wasn't personal. That it wouldn't cost me anything I couldn't afford to lose. There's a moment when you stop wondering if you're being placed into a role and start recognizing the shape of it. For me, it came during a quarterly review cycle. Not my own, but the department's. Leadership was discussing gaps, redundancies, points of resilience. I wasn't meant to be in the room, but I'd been asked to prep the materials. So I listened from the edge of the conversation, half present, half invisible. Someone asked, "If this initiative slips, who absorbs the impact?" Daniel answered without hesitation, "Arya can handle it. Not the team, not will adjust, me. No malice, no irony, just certainty." That's when it became clear. I wasn't seen as a contributor anymore. I was seen as a safeguard, a contingency plan. The person you route risk through so it doesn't reach the people with titles. The role was simple, really. Be competent. Be calm. Be accountable. Don't require attention. Don't complicate narratives. Be there when things break, and invisible when they work. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how Daniel introduced others, highlighting ambition, leadership potential, strategic thinking. When he introduced me, it was always about reliability, execution, trust. Words that sound positive until you realize they never lead anywhere. In meetings, my suggestions were treated as optional, my warnings as background noise, my labor as assumed. If I pushed back, the temperature in the room shifted. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Like I'd violated an unspoken agreement. So I stopped pushing. I became very good at the role. Better than anyone expected. I anticipated problems before they surfaced. I built systems that compensated for weak decision-making upstream. I trained people quietly, without credit, because it made the work smoother. And the smoother things ran, the less visible my influence became. There's a strange trap in being the person who makes everything work. When success is seamless, no one asks how it happened. When failure is contained, no one asks who absorbed it. I told myself this was temporary. That once stability was established, there would be room to renegotiate, to redefine, to step forward. But roles that benefit others are rarely reconsidered unless they stop functioning. And I was still functioning. I started to feel a dull fatigue, not physical, but existential. Like I was spending energy to maintain a version of myself that no longer matched who I was becoming. I had opinions, insights, a broader view of the organization than most people in leadership, but my role didn't include voice. It included output. Daniel never asked me what I wanted. Not because he didn't care, but because the system didn't require him to. I was delivering exactly what it needed. One afternoon, while reviewing another postmortem for an issue I hadn't caused, I caught my reflection in the conference room glass. I looked composed, professional, exactly how I was supposed to look. And I realized something quietly devastating. I had been so focused on being useful that I had become replaceable in the worst way. Not replaceable because anyone could do what I did, but because no one was invested in me doing it. Only in the function being filled. That's when I understood the role I'd been assigned wasn't accidental. It was a result of my own choices layered over a system that rewarded silence. Reliable, useful, invisible. And once a system decides that's who you are, it stops imagining you as anything else. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't come with a confrontation or a raised voice. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in a room that felt too quiet for what was about to settle inside me. We were reviewing an incident report. Another one. A systems failure that had rippled across teams, the kind that always triggered scrutiny from above. I had prepared the analysis, as I always did. Timeline. Root cause. Mitigation. I'd stayed late the night before to make sure it was airtight. Daniel skimmed it, nodded, and said, "We'll need to frame this carefully." That word, frame, landed differently than it used to. As the discussion unfolded, I watched him choose his language. How he emphasized complexity when describing decisions he'd made. How he simplified when describing the execution layer. Then came the moment. A senior leader asked directly, "So where did the breakdown occur?" There was a pause. Not long, just enough. Daniel looked at me, not in accusation, in expectation. And something in me didn't move. I felt the familiar urge to step in, to contextualize, to soften the impact. It rose automatically, like muscle memory. But this time, I noticed it. The reflex. The cost. I said nothing. The silence stretched. Not awkward, just unfilled. Daniel cleared his throat and answered. Carefully. Vaguely. Without naming me. The conversation moved on. No one noticed what had happened, but I did. It was the first time I had allowed a gap to exist where I would normally insert myself. The first time I let responsibility sit where it had been generated. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and felt different. Not triumphant, not defiant, just aware. I realized I had been treating silence as default, not as a choice. And that day, for the first time, I had chosen it intentionally. That choice didn't fix anything immediately. No apologies followed. No sudden respect. But something internal recalibrated. I stopped assuming it was my job to protect narratives that excluded me. Over the next days, I experimented. Quietly. I answered only what was asked. I documented without interpreting. I delivered analysis without cushioning it. And I watched. I watched how often I had been compensating for ambiguity, how frequently I had translated decisions into palatable stories so others didn't have to answer for them, how much emotional labor I'd been doing to keep things smooth. None of it was requested. It had simply become expected. The shift wasn't about anger, it was about clarity. I understood then that my invisibility had been partly self-maintained, not because I wanted to disappear, but because I believed restraint was the same as integrity. But integrity doesn't require self-sacrifice. It requires alignment. That day, I stopped aligning myself with outcomes I didn't control. I began to see the organization differently, not as a place that would eventually recognize fairness, but as a structure that responded to boundaries, to friction, to the redistribution of weight. And I had been carrying too much of it. I didn't announce a change. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't make demands. I simply stopped smoothing the edges. That's when I noticed something else. People became slightly less comfortable around me. Not hostile, just uncertain. They asked more clarifying questions. They hesitated before assuming. It was subtle, but it mattered. The shift wasn't visible from the outside. But inside, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was watching. And once you start watching, really watching, you see exactly where the system is fragile. That day didn't make me powerful, but it made me precise. And precision changes everything. After that Tuesday, my silence stopped being automatic. It became deliberate. I didn't withdraw. I didn't disengage. I still showed up prepared, still met deadlines, still delivered what was required. But I stopped filling the gaps that weren't mine to fill. And in those gaps, something revealing happened. People began to notice the absence. Questions lingered longer in meetings. Explanations sounded thinner without my framing. Decisions that once moved smoothly now required follow-up, clarification, justification. No one blamed me. Not yet. But I could feel the system adjusting, testing where responsibility would land without my quiet intervention. Daniel, in particular, seemed unsettled. He'd loop me into emails with vague prompts. Thoughts? Anything to add? I responded concisely. Factually. Without interpretation. Not cold, just complete. At first, I worried this would be read as disengagement. But what I learned was more interesting. People didn't read it as weakness. They read it as distance. And distance made them cautious. Silence, when it's chosen, changes how others behave. I noticed how often I had been the emotional buffer in conversations, softening language, absorbing frustration, reassuring stakeholders. Without that buffer, tensions surfaced earlier. Accountability became less abstract. I wasn't causing problems. I was allowing them to be seen. There's a difference. I also noticed how quickly people assumed I'd step in if something stalled. Old habits die slowly. But when I didn't, when I simply let the process follow its natural path, it forced others to engage more fully. Some resented it, some adapted. No one confronted me directly. That told me everything. If my change had been inappropriate, it would have been named. Instead, it was tolerated, because it was within the bounds of my role, just no longer beyond it. I started being more intentional about documentation. Not defensive, just precise. Meeting notes reflected exactly what was said, not what was implied. Timelines showed decisions alongside their owners. I removed myself from narratives where I didn't belong. This wasn't strategy yet. It was alignment, and alignment is disruptive in systems that rely on quiet distortion. Daniel began scheduling more one-on-ones. He'd ask how I was feeling, whether I was overloaded. I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't reassure him the way I used to. I realized then how much emotional reassurance I'd been providing without being asked. How much of my energy had gone into making others comfortable with decisions I didn't make. When that stopped, discomfort rose. And discomfort reveals power dynamics very quickly. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't playing a game. I was simply no longer volunteering to be the shock absorber. The most interesting change, though, was internal. I felt lighter. Not because things were easier, but because they were clearer. I wasn't constantly scanning for how to protect outcomes. I was focused on accuracy, and accuracy doesn't negotiate. I began to understand that silence, when chosen consciously, isn't passive. It's selective engagement. It's deciding where your energy belongs. People who mistake silence for weakness often rely on it. They build systems that assume someone else will absorb the consequences. When that assumption fails, the system reveals its cracks. I could see them now. Not as threats, but as information. I didn't act on that information yet. I wasn't ready. But I was paying attention in a way I never had before. Silence had become a tool, not for hiding, but for observing. And observation, over time, becomes leverage. What they never noticed was how much I saw. Not because I was spying, not because I was suspicious, but because when you stop performing, you have more bandwidth to observe. And I had spent years inside the machinery of that organization. I knew its rhythms, its shortcuts, its habits of convenience. While others spoke, I listened. While decisions were made quickly, I traced their downstream effects. While explanations were smoothed over, I noted where they bent. I began keeping my notebook closer, not to write more, but to write cleaner. Dates, names, exact language. Not interpretations, not emotions, just facts. I noticed how often Daniel made decisions verbally, then referenced them later as collective agreement. How frequently ambiguity worked in his favor. How rarely those moments were documented, because I had usually been the one translating them into something defensible. Without that translation, the gaps became visible. I noticed which stakeholders asked follow-up questions, and which didn't. Which teams absorbed confusion quietly, and which escalated. Patterns formed quickly once I stopped intervening. Preparation didn't look dramatic. It looked like consistency. I archived emails, saved calendar invites, kept versions of documents, not because I expected conflict, but because clarity requires memory, and organizations have very short ones. There's a myth that leverage comes from confrontation. It doesn't. It comes from alignment between truth and record, from the ability to show, not tell, how things actually unfolded. I learned which processes were performative and which were binding, which reviews mattered and which were ceremonial, which metrics were scrutinized and which were assumed. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself: how much I had been protecting people who didn't protect me. How often I had softened edges to preserve relationships that were asymmetrical. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I started mapping dependencies, not formally, just mentally. Who relied on which approvals? Where delays originated? How often decisions were retroactively justified rather than proactively owned? And slowly a picture emerged. The system wasn't malicious. It was lazy. It leaned on whoever would compensate. And I had been very compensatory. Once that stopped, the system didn't collapse, but it began to strain. I also noticed how Daniel adapted. He became more cautious in meetings, asked more questions, deferred occasionally, but he still assumed I would be there if things went wrong. He never asked if I was okay with that assumption, and I never corrected it, because this wasn't about exposing him. It was about understanding the architecture of accountability, about knowing exactly where responsibility could be traced if it ever needed to be. I didn't feel powerful during this phase. I felt focused, grounded, like someone who finally understood the rules of a game she'd been playing without a manual. What they never noticed was that my calm had shifted from accommodation to assessment, that my silence now held information, not avoidance. They didn't notice because they weren't looking. They were used to me being the background constant, the thing that made everything else possible. But constants are only invisible until they're removed. And I wasn't removing myself yet. I was positioning, quietly, methodically, without urgency. Because when you understand a system deeply enough, you don't need to rush. You know exactly how much time you have, and exactly when a choice will become unavoidable. That knowledge doesn't announce itself. It waits. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden email, no explosive discovery, no moment where everything clicked at once. It came quietly, the way most truths do, through accumulation. I was reviewing a chain of documents late one evening, not because anything was wrong, but because something felt unfinished. A decision log from months earlier didn't align with a summary Daniel had recently presented. The language was similar, but the sequence wasn't. I cross-referenced it with my notes, then with the calendar invite, then with an earlier draft that had never been circulated widely. That's when I saw it. The mistake, the one that would later define everything, had not originated where the official record suggested. It had been introduced earlier, upstream, during a meeting I hadn't even been required to attend. A meeting where Daniel had made a call without full information. A call that had been questioned briefly, then accepted. By him. At the time, I'd corrected for it quietly, adjusted downstream, absorbed the discrepancy, because that's what I did. But now, with distance and documentation, the trail was unmistakable. This wasn't a matter of interpretation. It was sequence. Cause and effect. Decision and outcome. And the record, my record, showed it clearly. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. I felt still. Because with clarity came responsibility. Not his, mine. I understood then that if this ever surfaced formally, the narrative would matter less than the timing. That truth, when revealed too late, is often treated as convenience. That systems protect continuity more than accuracy. And Daniel was continuity. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, not moving. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew too many options. I could surface it quietly, ask for correction, risk being seen as defensive. I could escalate formally, trigger an investigation that would affect more than just the two of us. I could do nothing and continue absorbing. None of those options felt clean. What I realized in that moment was that the reveal wasn't about him. It was about me finally seeing the full shape of the role I'd been playing, and the cost of continuing to play it. This wasn't leverage in the cinematic sense. It wasn't a weapon. It was information. And information doesn't demand action. It demands discernment. I printed nothing. Forwarded nothing. I saved the files in a folder I'd already been maintaining. Not marked, not highlighted. Just there. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while. The clarity didn't feel empowering. It felt heavy. Because once you see the truth clearly, you're responsible for how you handle it. And I knew something else now. If I spoke up after consequences arrived, it would look self-serving. If I spoke up before, it would destabilize more than it corrected. There was no version of this where I emerged untouched. That's the part people don't talk about. The cost of knowing. I didn't celebrate the reveal. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't even tell anyone. I just adjusted my internal timeline. I understood that a decision point was coming, whether I wanted it to or not. That eventually, the system would require someone to hold responsibility publicly. And I knew exactly where it would land if I didn't intervene. The reveal didn't make me powerful. It made me precise. And precision doesn't rush. It waits until the moment when action is no longer optional, but still intentional. The decision didn't arrive as a question. It arrived as inevitability. Once I saw the full arc, how the mistake had formed, how it had been quietly corrected, how the narrative had already begun drifting toward me, I understood that waiting wasn't neutral anymore. Time wouldn't clarify anything. It would only harden assumptions. I started mapping the possible outcomes, not emotionally, but structurally. If I did nothing, the organization would eventually need a name to attach to the failure. The error was too large to remain abstract. When that moment came, they wouldn't look upward. They never did. They would look for the person closest to execution, the person with the cleanest reputation, the one whose silence had already been normalized. Me. If I spoke up immediately, before consequences materialized, it would sound theoretical, defensive, like revisionist memory. Even with documentation, the response would likely be procedural. Why now? Why didn't you raise this earlier? Why are you bringing this up when things are stable? Stability is always valued more than accuracy. If I escalated formally, it would trigger a process that would ripple outward. Teams, timelines, trust. It wouldn't just affect Daniel. It would affect people who had done nothing wrong, people I respected. And I knew something else, too. Even if the record were corrected, the system would still see me as the disruption. The one who complicated things. The one who broke the unspoken agreement. None of the options were clean. They never are when power is uneven. The hardest part wasn't choosing what would protect me. It was choosing what aligned with who I wanted to be after this was over. I asked myself questions I'd been avoiding for years. What did I believe responsibility actually meant? Was truth still truth if it only surfaced when it benefited me? And what kind of person was I willing to become to preserve my career? I thought about my role, about how often I'd stepped in quietly to keep things moving, about how that pattern had taught everyone, including me, that I was there to absorb impact. I realized then that the decision wasn't just about this mistake. It was about whether I was willing to continue being the structural cushion for someone else's authority. The final option, the one I hadn't wanted to name, was to take responsibility. Fully. Publicly. To let the narrative land where it was already drifting. Not because it was fair, but because it would end something. If I took the fall, there would be consequences. I knew that. Titles are resilient. Reputations are not. Especially quiet ones. But it would also be final. No ambiguity. No slow erosion. No endless absorption. I wouldn't be protecting the system anymore. I would be stepping out of it. That realization didn't feel noble. It felt surgical. I understood the cost clearly. I also understood the alternative. staying, compromised, increasingly invisible, waiting for the next correction I'd be expected to make in silence. I didn't make the decision in one dramatic moment. I made it gradually, over several days, as I noticed how easily the organization leaned on my restraint, how confidently Daniel assumed I'd handle whatever came. The decision point wasn't about courage. It was about limits, and I had reached mine. When the time came, and it came faster than I expected, I didn't argue. I didn't redirect. I didn't surface my documentation. I acknowledged responsibility, calmly, completely. And in doing so, I stepped into the consequence I had been preparing for, knowing that while I might lose my position, I was finally choosing myself over a role that had already cost me too much. Once the decision was made, there was nothing left to debate, only execution. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't prepare speeches or contingency explanations. I simply adjusted how I moved through my days, quietly, intentionally, as if I were already gone. The formal review process unfolded the way these things always do. Measured language, careful phrasing, concern wrapped in professionalism. I answered questions directly. I didn't volunteer context that wasn't asked for. I didn't redirect attention. I didn't defend myself. That restraint confused people. They expected resistance, clarification, negotiation. Instead, I gave them closure. Behind the scenes, though, I was not passive. I reviewed my contract, my severance clauses, my non-compete. I consulted an employment attorney, not to fight, but to understand my boundaries. I organized my files, removed personal work, archived my notes, ensured nothing proprietary left with me, but nothing personal stayed behind either. This wasn't revenge planning, it was disentanglement. I also reached out, quietly, to two people outside the organization. Former colleagues. Not to vent, just to reestablish connection, to remind myself that my identity didn't end inside those walls. At work, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Conversations lowered when I walked by. Meetings became more formal. Daniel was careful, almost gentle. He thanked me more than usual. Avoided eye contact more than usual. He still had his title. I still did my job. Until I didn't. The official decision came in a private meeting. The language was rehearsed. Regretful. Procedural. I was thanked for my contributions. Assured this wasn't a reflection of my character. I accepted it without comment. That acceptance unsettled them more than anger would have. People expect emotion at endings. They expect resistance. When you deny them that, they're left alone with the implications. My last week was quiet. I wrapped projects, transferred knowledge, documented processes thoroughly, out of habit, not obligation. I didn't leave traps. I didn't burn bridges. I left clarity. What no one noticed was how much my absence began to echo before I was even gone. Questions went unanswered longer. Decisions stalled. Context had to be reconstructed. No one panicked yet. They assumed it would stabilize. I knew better. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means acting without spectacle. It means understanding that the most effective shifts are the ones that look like compliance until they're complete. When I handed in my badge, my laptop, my access, I felt a strange calm. Not relief, not grief, just finality. The role I'd been assigned no longer existed, because I wasn't in it. And systems don't know how to mourn quietly competent people until they're forced to function without them. I walked out without looking back. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already left. At first, nothing dramatic happened. That's the part people misunderstand about consequences. They rarely announce themselves. They arrive as delays, as confusion, as meetings that run longer than they used to. For a few weeks after I left, things appeared stable on the surface. The projects I'd wrapped were still moving. The documentation I'd left behind gave the impression of continuity. But continuity without context is fragile. Small questions started surfacing. Who had approved this adjustment? Why was that assumption built into the process? Where had a certain decision originated? The answers were there, but scattered, embedded in notes, emails, conversations that had relied on me to translate them in real time. Without that translation, the system slowed. I heard about it secondhand at first. A former colleague mentioned a meeting that had gone in circles. Another asked if I remembered why a particular workaround existed. I answered when I could. Briefly, carefully. I didn't insert myself back into the machine. Inside the organization, the weight began to shift. Daniel was still in his role, still confident, still protected by title. But now he had to explain things I had once absorbed. He had to reconstruct narratives without the benefit of my quiet framing. That takes energy, attention, risk. Mistakes that would have been smoothed over before now lingered just long enough to be noticed. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. People started realizing how much invisible work had been happening. Not in a dramatic way, just in a something feels off way. The organization responded the way it always does, with more meetings, more reviews, more checklists. But checklists don't replace judgment, and judgment had been one of the things I'd carried quietly. I wasn't there to see the turning points. I only heard about them later. A missed dependency. A stakeholder asking a pointed question. A timeline that slipped without a clean explanation. Nothing traceable to me directly. That's what made it unsettling. The absence didn't scream. It whispered, and whispers spread slowly, but persistently. I also noticed something else. No one reached out to ask why I'd left the way I did. No exit interview follow-up. No curiosity, just polite distance. That told me the organization wasn't ready to interrogate its own patterns. It was still in stabilization mode, focused on maintaining the appearance of control. But appearances can't carry weight forever. The consequences weren't about punishment. They were about exposure. About the cost of assuming someone else will always compensate. I didn't feel vindicated hearing about the strain. I felt confirmed. Confirmed that my role had been structural, not incidental. That my invisibility had been functional. And that removing it didn't cause chaos, but it did remove the cushion. Daniel, I was told, became more guarded, more cautious in meetings, less expansive. He still had his title, but less margin. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't overthrow. It simply withdraws support and lets reality redistribute itself. The system began adjusting, not to me, but to my absence. And once that adjustment starts, it can't be reversed. By the time anyone realized something fundamental had changed, they were already behind it. The first real sign wasn't a failure. It was urgency. Meetings that used to be scheduled a week out were suddenly marked high priority. Emails grew longer, more defensive. Decisions that once moved with confidence now circled for approval, looping back to people who weren't sure they owned them. The system was trying to recreate what it had lost, without naming it. I heard about the panic indirectly. A former teammate called me one evening, her voice low. "It's just messy now," she said. "No one knows who's supposed to catch things before they escalate." That sentence stayed with me. Catch things before they escalate. That had been my role. Not officially, but functionally. Daniel, I learned later, had tried to reassign pieces of my work across multiple people. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it fractured accountability. Each person held part of the picture. No one held the whole. When issues arose, there was no single buffer, just a chain of explanations. Leadership noticed. Not immediately, but gradually, as patterns repeated. Questions started coming back sharper. Why hadn't this been flagged earlier? Who signed off on that assumption? Why did no one see the risk? The irony was painful. These were the same questions I'd been answering quietly for years, before they ever reached that level. Now there was no quiet answer. I was told Daniel requested an internal review, not of the incident that led to my exit, but of process gaps. It was framed as proactive, as learning-oriented, but reviews don't restore trust. They document loss. By the time leadership started asking how decisions were being tracked, how narratives were formed, how risks were communicated, it was already too late. The continuity they'd relied on was gone. And continuity, once broken, can't be rebuilt by policy alone. Someone reached out to me then. Not Daniel, but an executive I'd worked with years earlier. The message was polite, curious, carefully neutral. Would you be open to sharing your perspective on how certain processes evolved? I read it twice, then once more. I didn't respond, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. My perspective hadn't been missing before. It had been present and ignored. Offering it now would only serve to stabilize a system that had already shown me where I stood within it. The organization wasn't asking how to do better. It was asking how to feel less exposed, and I was no longer responsible for that. What they wanted, though they didn't say it, was a way to fix things without naming what had been lost, without acknowledging how much had been routed through one person because it was convenient. But you can't fix what you won't name. By the time Daniel realized the full extent of the gap, his options were limited. Titles protect position, not perception. And perception had shifted. He wasn't blamed, not officially, but he was watched more closely, asked to justify more, trusted less intuitively. That's the quiet consequence of systems that rely too heavily on uncredited labor. When it disappears, the spotlight turns harsh. I didn't celebrate that shift. I didn't track it closely. I was already building something new, something that didn't require me to disappear in order to function. The moment for correction had passed, not because no one cared, but because the system had chosen comfort over clarity for too long. And once that choice is made consistently, reversal isn't corrective. It's cosmetic. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. Daniel asked to meet for coffee. Not an office, not a conference room, a neutral space. That alone told me this wasn't about process, it was about narrative. I agreed. He looked tired. Not defeated, just worn in a way that comes from carrying questions you're not used to answering. We exchanged pleasantries, commented on the weather, the city, safe things. Then he said, I've been thinking a lot about how everything unfolded. I waited. I don't think I fully understood how much weight you were carrying, he continued. And I regret that. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was acknowledgement, carefully phrased. I nodded, not to validate him, but to keep the conversation grounded. He went on. Spoke about pressure, about expectations from above, about how fast things moved, how easy it was to rely on someone competent. I never meant for you to be the one who took the fall, he said. I looked at him then, really looked. I know, I said. That surprised him. I didn't explain. I didn't list examples. I didn't surface documentation. There was no need. The moment wasn't about proving anything. It was about boundaries. I made a choice, I continued. Not because it was fair, but because it was final. He shifted in his seat. You could have told me. I did, I said gently. Just not with words. Silence settled between us. Not tense, just honest. He asked if I'd ever consider coming back. Not to my old role, something redefined. He said it like an offering. I declined, not out of spite, out of alignment. That chapter's closed, I said, and reopening it wouldn't change what it taught me. He nodded slowly. I could see him recalibrating, trying to place me in a new category now that the old one no longer fit. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives fully formed, and people adjust after the fact. We finished our coffee. He thanked me for my time, for my honesty, for everything I'd done. I thanked him too, for the clarity. When I walked away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. There was no heat in the confrontation because there didn't need to be. The truth had already settled where it belonged. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to re-enter a system that only values you when you're willing to disappear. I used to think identity was something you earned through endurance, through being useful, through staying longer than necessary and absorbing more than was fair. I don't believe that anymore. Who I am now isn't defined by what I survived, or by what I gave up. It's defined by what I no longer negotiate. After I left, there was a stretch of time that felt unstructured. No meetings, no deadlines dictated by someone else's priorities. At first, that quiet was unsettling. I realized how much of my sense of worth had been tethered to being needed. Letting go of that took time. I didn't rush into something new. I took short-term consulting work, on my terms. Projects with clear scope, clear ownership, Clear accountability. I noticed how different it felt to be asked for my perspective before decisions were made, not after. I noticed how often people listened when I spoke, because I chose when to speak. I also noticed how quickly systems reveal themselves when you're not embedded in them. I could see patterns faster, set boundaries earlier, decline roles that required me to be invisible to function. I didn't become louder, I became more selective. The quiet dominance I live in now isn't about control, it's about alignment. About choosing environments that don't require self-erasure as the cost of competence. I still document, I still observe, but I don't carry weight that isn't mine. People sometimes ask if I regret how things ended, if I wish I'd spoken up sooner, if I'd do it differently now. The honest answer is complicated. I wish I had understood earlier that silence is interpreted, whether you intend it to be or not. I wish I'd known that being reliable without boundaries teaches people exactly how far they can lean. But regret assumes a version of me who knew then what I know now. I didn't. What I had then was integrity, patience, a belief in fairness. Those weren't weaknesses. They were just misaligned with the system I was in. Now I pair them with discernment. I don't confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. I don't confuse calm with consent. And I don't wait for systems to recognize my value before I do. My career didn't end. It transformed. I lost a title. I lost a version of myself that believed being indispensable was the same as being respected. What I gained was autonomy, clarity, a sense of authorship over my own narrative. And perhaps most importantly, I gained the ability to walk away without anger, because walking away was no longer a loss. It was a decision. There's a story we're often taught, quietly, persistently, that if you work hard enough, stay reasonable enough, and absorb enough discomfort, things will eventually balance out. That fairness is a natural outcome. I don't believe that anymore. What I learned is simpler and harder. Systems don't correct imbalance on their own. They stabilize around it. They reward whatever makes them feel efficient, not whatever is just. In my case, efficiency looked like silence, like reliability without boundaries, like being the person who could be counted on to take responsibility without being given authority. And for a long time, I mistook that for strength. The truth is, taking the fall for a mistake my boss made didn't make me noble. It made me free, because it ended a role that was costing me more than I was willing to keep paying. He kept his title. I lost my career as I knew it, but I didn't lose my voice. I didn't lose my principles. And I didn't lose my ability to choose differently the next time I recognized the pattern forming. Quiet dominance isn't about winning loudly. It's about knowing when to stop participating in dynamics that depend on your self-erasure. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful reversal isn't exposing someone. It's removing the support that made their authority feel effortless. There was no revenge in my ending. No public reckoning. Just a redistribution of weight. And that's enough. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Being dependable is not the same as being protected. Being calm is not the same as being valued. And silence, while it can be dignified, should never be automatic. Choose it, or don't, but know the cost either way. Before we end, I want to leave you with a question. Not rhetorical, not simple. Have you ever taken responsibility for something that wasn't truly yours, just to keep the peace? And if so, what did it cost you? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.